Thank you for having me here. Admittedly, it was a little bit of an early flight this morning, so I'm still catching up. Luckily, we got some caffeine. There's a lot of activity going on this Congress, and Craig and I work closely together on the Agriculture Workforce Coalition, and this was a group that was brought together about informally at actually the first E-Verify push, and then more formally the end of 2012 into the beginning of last Congress, working together on a unified message of ag labor reform. There have been some trials and tribulations. I think when you get into the weeds, there's a lot of different perspectives and needs a lot around the industry, but it has been a great venture to all work together and have that common voice, and it makes it a lot easier for our Hill visits and members of Congress to know that we are truly speaking together in agriculture, even within our individual organizations and broadly as that coalition moves forward. This Congress has been a little bit frustrating. Immigration is always a very political issue, and this Congress is no different. We see the DHS funding appropriations bill, which was kind of the first kickoff of the political cry that is the immigration debate, and the House originally passing funding legislation that would defund the executive actions of President Obama's executive actions on immigration. The Senate trying to also pass those bills, but could not get the votes. And then to last Friday's showdown of how are we going to fund the Department of Homeland Security? How are we going to get this done? And then again this week with the extension and ultimately a bill passed yesterday out of the House with the clean funding bill without that defunding of Homeland Security amendments. Because of some of that tenor and the executive actions being out there and the political reactions to that by Republican-controlled Congress, there's been an increased interest in doing enforcement-only immigration reform. And the border security component from Farm Bureau's perspective, we support the border security bill that's been introduced and marked up in the House. Our policy is pretty broad on border security. We support increased technology, law enforcement efforts. We aren't border experts, though, under any sense of the imagination as far as metrics and the weeds of that, but we felt the bill met that policy. But the interior enforcement side of this debate is a different ballgame. We know in agriculture we heavily rely on an immigrant labor force, and that labor force is largely unauthorized. And so we have to make sure that that stability is protected with proposals of interior enforcement, specifically the E-Verify. And I just saw that you had that good commercial, and that's very true. Farm Bureau and the AWC has been working actively opposing the legislation. The Judiciary Committee chairman is in no easy position. It's definitely not enviable. The Republican conference has an interest in doing enforcement only. I think the committee really only wants to do enforcement only. And the chairman, while he understands agriculture's needs and agriculture's opposition to E-Verify legislation without a workable agricultural solution, he felt and gave us the kind of the heads up a little bit last week before everything started moving that this was going to have to go forward, and that he was in a little bit in the chicken and the egg situation of, well, we asked, well, can you guarantee us a timeline of when an agriculture solution moves? And they could not, but they could guarantee it would never move if we didn't do enforcement. That, unfortunately for us, though, is not enough. Again, it's not an enviable position, but at the end of the day, the risk of mandatory E-Verify on agriculture is too high for us, and the impact too large on the ground for us to sit on the sidelines and watch it go through the process and pray and hope that the agriculture solution moves next. We just don't have that confidence that can happen. And frankly, there's not much political incentive for the Republican conference to continue those discussions if all the enforcement is through. From the prospects of the actual bill, there is a 3-year phase-in for agriculture. However, while the thought is appreciated, that really does nothing for our stability. And in many instances, it will make our stability worse because we'll be the only industry without mandatory E-Verify, and that means more unauthorized workers would be kind of flooding into the farms, which sounds good in theory, except for you would then know they're all undocumented because they can't get jobs anywhere else. And also it would give ICE just a target of well, if this is the only industry not using mandatory E-Verify, where else are they going to go? So it doesn't give us the stability that we need, and so we have been actively opposing that. We urged Judiciary Committee members to vote against it, at a minimum be saying statements about the agriculture needs and the impact on agriculture, and we'll continue those efforts as it moves through the process. I think time will tell how it moves through the process. With the DHS vote yesterday, in my opinion, and Craig, you can give yours as well, I think maybe the urgency is a little bit less than it was. I think the Speaker hoped to arrange with some of the Republican conference folks some assurances that we'll move enforcement really quickly if we do a 3-week extension. And when that 3-week extension got shortened to 1 week, I think he went with the strategy of let's just move the clean bill and get this passed. And I think that probably will make some difficult lunch, closed-door meetings within the Republican conference, definitely. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but we definitely are on guard if E-Verify does move to the floor. And same position, very opposed, and trying to work to ensure that it doesn't get passed ultimately out of the House.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you again. Most of the faces in this room are familiar, and for those who aren't, I look forward to getting to know you. This has become a labor of love, and one of these days we need to get it in the rearview mirror. Sure. I want to start by just offering to give credit where credit is due. Kristi has, if you want to come to Washington and make your mark as a lobbyist, you don't do immigration. It's a 25-year issue. And if we're lucky, it happens, something big happens once in a career. And Kristi, jumped into the cold, deep end of the swimming pool and learned to swim very rapidly. She has mastered the details of the issue. She has helped on a very important point. I mean, we've all worked together to sort of reunify agriculture, and ag unity is fundamentally important to getting this job done. And so the commitment that she's made and the rest of us have all tried to live up to, I just want to give credit where credit is due. She's done amazing work in this space, and most of our peers in this space would much rather be working on something else, because on this issue, everything's upside down. It's complicated. The politics, your usual friend is suddenly your enemy, and your usual enemy is possibly your friend, and so it's not a popular place for a small business or agricultural lobbyist to work. So I just wanted to say that at the outset. Secondly, I'll just reiterate the ag unity piece. If we don't hang together, we hang alone. And I think one way to illustrate how important the unity piece has been is the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Krista Harden, often says, it's okay to look back, just don't stare. And if you'll permit me to look back for just a moment, the bill that passed the United States Senate, the bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill that passed in the last Congress, you might look at it and you might find 25 or 50 things that you hate about it, but you better not hate the ag provisions. They were hard fought, hard negotiated, hard won, and if we could have them tomorrow, we would go home and say, problem pretty much solved. They were solid provisions. They did not choose winners and losers among agricultural sectors. They did not choose winners and losers among geography. They did not choose winners and losers among current H-2A employers and people who have chosen not to go into H-2A or who can't go into H-2A in its current form. So all that is to say, I mean, I'm not suggesting to you that suddenly the environment will allow us to get that deal back, but it was a good deal, and if elements of it can see the light of day again, we could do much worse. Kristi's touched some on the enforcement, how the goalposts suddenly moved from we need to secure the border to we need to do everything in the enforcement toolkit before we even start to have a conversation about the agricultural workforce. But that's sort of where, at least in the eyes of some of the Judiciary Committee members, we have found ourselves. There was one interesting bright spot in the markup yesterday of the E-Verify bill in the Judiciary Committee. I mean, the E-Verify bill came out of the committee on a straight party line vote, which is what everybody expected. But there was one moment of very interesting clarity when Susan DelBene, a congresswoman from Washington State, Democrat, offered an amendment that would have shielded agriculture from E-Verify until the Secretaries of Labor and Agriculture essentially certified that E-Verify in ag would not cause a labor shortage. The amendment was opposed on a party line vote, as you know, the Republicans opposed it, but Darrell Issa from Southern California, and if you don't know Darrell Issa, he's pretty darn conservative, and in his role as, government administration and oversight chair in the last Congress, he was a very polarizing partisan figure. So what comes next is really interesting. He said, I can't support my colleague's amendment, but I agree with her. I agree with her that E-Verify in agriculture will cause a disaster. We have to come together and figure this thing out and roll up our sleeves. And then he went on to talk about how he had had dinner the previous night with former Congressman Howard Berman, who had been the lead Democrat in the years-long effort around the so-called Ag Jobs bill, which was not free of controversy. But in the conversation, he essentially said, I was once a co-sponsor of that bill. I remembered that, but not very many people do. So anyway, the bottom line is, Issa said, we're going to have to figure out how to commit to working together to get this thing done. Those aren't his exact words, but that's the gist of it. So I don't know where we go from here, but that was an important moment in a very difficult debate. I want to talk just for a second about leadership, because our fate now sits in the hands of House leadership. There is no question in our minds that John Boehner wants to get this done. John Boehner has committed privately that we're going to get an ag piece done. Now, saying it doesn't mean it happens, but Boehner is not our problem. Kevin McCarthy is a little bit harder to read at this stage in his political evolution. But, and it's important to understand the following. What McCarthy has essentially decided that his committee chairs are like lesser gods. They're pretty powerful, and we're going to give them lots of room to be powerful and do their thing. So McCarthy is not going to stomp all over his committee chairs, and he is going to pay deference to the regular process, to regular order. And that all means, they didn't interfere in Goodlatte marking up his bill in the committee. But the question is, will something go forward, and if so, how will it go forward? Our near-term job is to take on as best faith as we can what Mr. Goodlatte has told us, which is, I want to do something for agriculture. And we are attempting to work with him to frankly get the bill he had last year to a place where we can actively support it. The bill that he had last year chose winners and losers. It was not the answer that we all need. So we're going to engage in that process. We can be optimistic, we can be pessimistic, but we're going to be happy-faced, and we're going to engage in that process. And that's what Kristi and I and our colleagues are doing right now. Depending on how that comes out, it's a question of what does leadership do? Is there a way forward that leadership finds a way to enable? But I have to tell you that our view is we get one shot. If we accept a third of a loaf, if we accept a solution that's just a handful of tweaks to H2A and that's all, that can't work for the nation's agriculture. We can't go there. We need a solution. We can be flexible on some of the very polarizing details, like whether there's an indelible path to citizenship or not, and that kind of stuff. Some of those issues aren't an employer's issues. We may have our own personal views, our own moral views, our own whatever. But we can be, as agriculture, flexible on some of those points. But we have to know that what we agree to can meet the needs of the diverse industries around the country. That's the commitment that we all have to make to you. A quick word on an ag exemption, because some people are saying, oh, we'll just exempt ag from E-Verify. As Kristi suggested, that's no solution. We're not in this for an exemption, we're in this for a solution. If we got an exemption through the political process, which is doubtful, we would live to rue the day, because we'd have a target about this big on our backs, that all the illegals are in agriculture. And the rest would be history. It would also be a public relations disaster, because the anti-immigrant groups like NC Listen and the national groups would pile in, and they'd say, Congress is exempting the biggest lawbreakers of all. You know, and it would be a terrible, it would reinforce all the worst stereotypes, which we know to not really be the center of the truth, about, you know, you just want a cheap, illegal, exploitable labor force. So an exemption, as good as it might sound at first pass, is a bad idea, and we're doing the educational work on that. I think the biggest question of all is, will an opportunity emerge in the coming months to get something done, or is the way that the Homeland Security funding unfolded the beginning of a mini ice age? A mini ice age that lasts at least, forget about global warming, a mini ice age that lasts until at least there is a new president in office. We don't know the answer to that. We're not given the luxury of deciding that our fate, and that was, our obligation is to serve you all and to serve our members by seeking every opportunity to tee up a solution in this moment in time and to work to protect our interests as best as we can. I'll end on one positive note. You know, we're doing the rounds. We're trying to see everybody we can in Congress. And I think, you know, with respect to your own delegation, I had the chance, just based on the long-standing relationship that I've had with Ray Starling, to get in and see Ray Starling on Mr. Tillis's staff. He's, you know, had served him here. Had served Commissioner Troxler here. He's now up there. And, you know, Tillis is on the immigration subcommittee. Why he would choose that, it's like the worst punishment, but he's on it. We're happy he's there. That's all I'm saying, because while I don't know that he can lead this parade tomorrow, you know, he understands what's going on in the real world. Similarly, David Rouser, I had a chance to sit down with him last week. David has been a good friend for many, many years, and while he is also not in a good position to lead this parade, he will do everything, I believe, he will do everything he can quietly behind the scenes to help agriculture. So there are reasons for optimism in your own delegation, but you know, it's going to be a long and winding road. Hopefully we've got a couple minutes. Kristi and I would love to take questions or react to things on your mind. Johnny.
Craig, this question's for you. Your analogy of Ice Age, explain.
Well, I mean, I think that there are those who believed that the funding for Homeland Security could become an engine and could become a hook for moving some kind of reform in Congress. I think if you want to look at the environment we're in and look for some positives, one positive is that arguably President Obama's executive actions have kind of broken the seal on it's got to be comprehensive or nothing. It's got to be and so now there is a sense that we can at least have a conversation about steps rather than everything all at once. And admittedly, my own personal view, it's also a professional view, so I'm not split personality on this, I believe it to be true. You know, at the end of the day, I'm sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. I took my mind went in two directions. I'm having a senior moment. I think at the end, yeah, back to the Ice Age. The reality is that debate could have allowed us a window. I'm sorry, where I was going, Johnny, is I was going to the issue of steps at a time. I believe that Congress does comprehensive anything rather poorly. Congress doesn't know how to, that was my point, I'm sorry. Congress does not know how to do comprehensive anything well. And so to the extent we get back to a frame where we can have a conversation about what's the most broken, and if there's a vision about where we're trying to get, and if we can get there some steps at a time, okay. In this debate, ag's in a different place, tech's in a different place, et cetera. I think that the Ice Age, if there's a mini Ice Age, it's just simply that the politics of this thing got too roiled and we just can't get a critical mass. The way this issue gets solved is if there are enough Republicans who finally reach the point that they agree that the best way to beat the president, stop the president, overcome the president, is to legislate in a way that supersedes the president. Not just to block the president, but to actually do what the legislative process can do that the president cannot. And on the Democratic side of the aisle, the challenge there is that there are enough people who are willing to be pragmatic, who are willing to take steps that are good on the ground, rather than all or nothing, comprehensive or nothing, and most importantly, that aren't going to cling to this issue as a wedge issue with respect to the 2016 presidential election. So they're willing to do something, which kind of takes everybody off the hook. It's kind of the equivalent of a political cold shower. And it's going to take both of those. It's going to take some Democrats, and it's going to take an awakening among Republicans. And if that happens, we don't need to have a mini ice age. But if that doesn't happen, I think it's not until there's a new occupant in the White House.
Is a guest worker program or legislation completely out of the question? Can we get away from the immigration issues and have just an agricultural guest worker program?
I think, I mean, Kristi and I should both respond to this. I would say, in my view, the long term is getting a guest worker program we know we can live with. That's absolutely the long term. And for some of you, it's the immediate term, and we respect that. We cannot solve this problem, though, without something that deals with the current workforce, because the current workforce is a majority of the workforce. And I would argue that if you get just one fix, and the fix is the guest worker program, and everybody files into it, that we will have a different kind of disaster. Because suddenly, the bandwidth that has struggled to admit between 50 and 100,000 workers each year is going to have to admit more than 1 million. And how are we going to get there? I mean, so there's the bandwidth problem. There's also the practicality problem. I mean, are people going to report to leave the country and hope that there's going to be somebody that wants them for a visa? So if we could wave a magic wand today and have a really rational solution, we'd get a good guest worker program, and we would have some kind of an opportunity for the folks who are here without proper immigration status to atone for the sin of illegal entry and to receive an agricultural work permit. And the work permit is silent on the question of residency, permanent residency or citizenship. It is long-term, 5 years or more. It might be renewable. And we just let these folks keep working. And we allow some of them, within the structure of our current immigration system, to, if they aspire to become permanent residents, we don't prohibit it, but we solve the Republican problem of no special path. I think we could do that if the politics give us an opportunity. But I would argue that we need two solutions in order to actually survive for the long term. Kristi, what?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously our current workforce is what brings us more into that immigration debate. I mean, that's the emotional side of this issue, the unauthorized individuals that are in the country, and a large percentage, like Craig said, of our workforce is in that camp. So it makes our job a little bit more challenging, and I think the easy way out for a lot of members is to do guest worker reform and focus on that initially with maybe some some slighter fixes for our current workforce in that context, but not necessarily more broadly. Just because, again, that's more politically favorable of a position to take. I do think that making sure the guest worker program works and is efficient and is very streamlined is probably one of the most important parts of our job to do, and making sure it works in the long term, because we have one crack at this, like Craig said, and we got to make sure that that works and that solution works. But I also think we have to be realistic about at least this Congress and keep fighting through the politics of this Congress on what the appetite is for a current workforce, and be creative in our thinking about how we can approach that. I think the Senate process was an ideal solution with our current workforce. A blue card program that allowed people an expedited pathway to legal permanent residency, that had that incentive to stay in the industry. That's ideal. I don't see a world in the House of Representatives where we can get that. So I think we have to kind of figure out where can we tweak and where can we give, and hope that we can acquire some work authorization where these workers aren't funneled into a program, but also recognize it's probably not going to be our entire workforce. So, and just because of the political climate. So we have to kind of work within those constraints. And in a lot of the work that we're doing with Chairman Goodlatte and Judiciary Committee staff is making sure they know that and they see those, the impact that putting everyone into a guest worker program can have. The bandwidth issue is one. Also the practical things of being within a guest worker program, whether that be the petition process or whether that be certain labor protections, And we know to get signed into law, there's going to be certain labor protections that are added. It's just the reality of it. So although the bill at this point, from a guest worker standpoint, is incredibly labor or employer friendly, and there's no housing, no transportation, no private right of action, no legal services, there are good things, you know, to that regard. It's going to get pushed to the middle out of the committee process. So we know that and have to think through the end game process there while we have these conversations with, you know, a member who does want to make it work for employers. I mean, that's his focus, is making it work for employers. So there's a lot of balancing and configuration, but there are sympathies for us, as there always have been. I agree with Craig on the piece by piece, and that maybe there is more willingness to do, on both sides of the aisle, to do a piece by piece approach. And I think from the employment side of it, agriculture and tech have those kind of the first up at bat for it. And I think we both support each other's initiatives as far as industries go. And it might be a matter of who can get the substance ready if the speaker says go.
As I understand it, there are no provisions in this current workforce bill that deals with the undocumented ag force, the workforce. In the last bill, there was a provision if they went home, then they could come back in as a guest worker. But do I understand that correctly? There's not that provision granted to the undocumented workers in this current bill?
There has not been an agricultural bill introduced yet, this Congress. So I don't know what bill, whether it's in the E-Verify, yeah. So that bill is only E-Verify. So it doesn't, which is one of our reasons why we oppose it. I mean, it's only E-Verify. It doesn't address anything related to a solution for our workforce. The bill, you're correct, as far as the bill last Congress in the House, it did provide a kind of a waiver that allowed people to stay. They had to report home for a period, wherever home may be, which is, there's nothing that's been introduced, but that's the substance that we're working on with the chairman and the committee staff. So we envision anything that will be introduced will have something for our current workforce, and it goes back to what that is. But I don't think the chairman would back up off of what he did last Congress as far as that. So I would say we're at least guaranteed that waiver and funneling into the program like last Congress. That's not our ideal solution, but that's, I think, where the chairman starts.
Thank you.
Yep.
Kristi, to pivot a little bit off of the immigration issue and talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act. I don't know if you guys are involved in that much, but I can tell you on our farm, it has hit us hard. It took us a long time to figure out what we had to do, and even longer to figure out how much it was going to cost us. And now we know, and a lot of my friends here in this room, they haven't probably came under the threshold yet, but they're getting ready to. And when they do, they better grab hold of their pocketbook, because it'll put some of us out of business. We have to pay the way it's set up now. Is there anything on the horizon to address the Affordable Care Act in agriculture?
So Farm Bureau is working on the ACA. It is not my issue, luckily. However, we're consistently committed to, our policy is explicit, repeal it, but then, what steps as bills come along to actually improve it. One such bill is the STARS Act, and that addresses the seasonality issue and makes a more uniform approach to a 6-month seasonal workforce and not having them count towards your fully equivalent. Right now there's a lot of question, or full-time equivalent, there's a lot of question of the calculation is different to determine whether you're a big employer and then whether you actually have to provide the insurance. So again, not my issue, so I'm not completely well versed in it, but it is something we're monitoring. I know Ms. Elmer's also had a bill last Congress, and has she introduced it in this?
She has not, but I spoke with them, and y'all probably spoke with them when you were there last week. That she is queued up ready, but she's kind of watching how the STARS Act moves forward.
So the 6-month provision in the STARS Act isn't as long as we would like it to be. And what Ms. Elmer's bill does is just exempt H-2A visa workers from the ACA. The reason for the 6 months and why it is the 6 months is that bill is perceived as a technical change to the ACA, and from a political perspective, it's much easier to move that than exempting any subset of people from the ACA. So it's looking at, no, this isn't necessarily our maximum ideal solution, but it also something that might get signed into law, and so we kind of have to give and take on that, versus having a statement bill that probably isn't going to go anywhere.
It mirrors the language with the U.S. Treasury and the IRS recognized as seasonal. So it's not new legislation, it's basically what she says is a technical correction, so it would mirror what is already in law.
I would just add that one of the profound stupidities, and there's more than one, but one of them in the Affordable Care Act is the fact that H-2A and H-2B, temporary non-immigrant workers, are covered under the Act just like domestic workers. And when you think about the context in which these people are up here working, it makes no sense whatsoever to impose the same kind of insurance requirement. Virtually all of them are covered under workers' comp, so that if there's a workplace injury, there's a remedy. And if they suffer a catastrophic injury that renders them unable to work, they're probably going to go home, for their care. And so if there were something that ought to happen in that space, it would be a very, very minimal something that would allow access to clinics, for just routine healthcare needs during the duration of their stay, that are generally minor. But the politics of it are, there are those who believe if H-2A and H-2B workers are exempt, that it's yet another incentive for you as an employer to hire them instead of hiring Americans. And that's where the politics, just go south on us. Very unfortunate.
Yep.
Can you give us some advice on what bullet points to communicate to our representative and congressman when we have a 90-second window with them? As an example, Mark Meadows. When I meet with Mark Meadows, now he points a finger in my face and says, no amnesty. He won't listen to my story. He won't give me a time to communicate with me. How can I break through that barrier? What can I say to him?
Yeah, I think the easiest way, and that's a hard situation because you're not really getting much of an opportunity, but from as effective as Craig and I pretend to be, at the end of the day, it's your personal stories and the impact that it's going to have. For example, on the enforcement only side of things that you verify, what impact that would have on your farm. And from a broad standpoint, production falls, from a Labor Study Farm Bureau commission, production will fall up to $60 billion and food prices rise 6% if there is mandatory e-verify and enforcement only immigration reform approach. From broader of what we actually need, how I kind of summarize it always is, the current system is broken. Agriculture is the prime example of that. And what we have to have in a full solution is a work authorization for our current workforce and a new flexible visa program at a really high level.
And I would just add, consistent with what Kristi said, your best arguments that are legitimate from your perspective are economic arguments. There are lots of ways to look at this issue. Unfortunately, some of our Republican friends have chosen to see it as a cultural issue. It is fundamentally an economic issue. It is a competitiveness issue. It is a jobs issue. So if you can take what Kristi said, what does this mean in your own business or in your own sector of agriculture, and you can remind people that for every farm worker that gets hired in agriculture, there are 2 to 3 people that have a job in the surrounding economy, the farm services and products that go into production, the things that happen after production. There's 2 to 3 jobs that are going to mostly disappear if the production goes away. And so our best arguments are the economic arguments. I would also, specific to Mr. Meadows, I would urge you, if you don't know him, to reach out and have a quiet conversation with Bert Lemke's at Van Wingerden International. Bert's a good friend, and he's been in the trenches on this thing tirelessly. And you ought to gang up, team up.
Thank you.
Yep.
Maybe you need to explain to us what a Republican congressman's definition of amnesty is. Because our perception of amnesty is one thing, their perception of amnesty is another, and then on top of that, we're really not, from a farmer standpoint, asking for amnesty.
I hate the word amnesty. Frankly, like, you're right. We could ask every single person in this room, and they will have a different definition of amnesty. And I would say most congressmen would have a different, men and women would have a different definition of amnesty depending on what day it is, depending who they're in front of and who they're talking to. You know, to some in the hell no camp, it's anything. I mean, they argued the border security was a gateway to amnesty. To others, it's citizenship, you know, and maybe not necessarily the, you know, addressing of that population, but the actual component of the citizenship. So I try to avoid it. I try to avoid the terminology, and Farm Bureau is very diverse, as you all know, so I do get some calls from people who aren't quite as understanding about why Farm Bureau is out there on immigration reform as we are. And I always talk through with those individuals the benefit of reform, that the status quo is broken, and through reform, through a more liberal Senate bill, the typical rhetoric points of everyone speaking Spanish, everyone is criminals, no one pays taxes, everyone's on the system, all of those things are addressed in reform. You know, back taxes, all of those things are addressed through reform, and frankly through a more liberal skewed Senate bill. Now the Republicans control Congress, they have the opportunity to even make, you know, if they so choose, address more of those kind of rhetoric point concerns about the line, you know, the length of the line for visa workers or who've stayed in the process and doing things right, whether it be the language issue, tax issue, the length of time to become, you know, and what that status ultimately is. Like, there's an ability within reform to make those changes, and if you don't do anything, nothing changes. And so the same individuals are going to be at the local hospital, and those same rhetoric points are going to exist. And again, through reform, you make those changes. And the most, especially in your neighbors and your communities, the average person has no idea what was in that bill besides citizenship. And most people don't even know that it was a 10 to 12 year arduous pathway of lots of hoops to jump through to get in line for the ultimate status. So there's a lot of learning curve of just of the basics of, we're not asking to wave a magic wand and everyone becomes citizenship and that's it. You know, there's things that have to be conducted responsibly to make people, you know, become right with the law. I also equate it often to shoplifting. You know, you get a probation or you pay a restitution. Not every crime in the criminal code in the United States faces the death penalty. I mean, there's leveled out punishments that fit the crime, and coming in and without status is a crime. It's the equivalent of a misdemeanor. So there's things, you know, a probationary status that can be done through reform that make people, you know, come right with the law, but also acknowledge the reality of it is, you know, deportation isn't going to be the solution. And no responsible individual talks about that on Capitol Hill.
Mr. Webster, you're in good company. Mr. Webster's on your side. Amnesty is defined as an unconditional pardon, and nothing that we've advocated for is anywhere close to unconditional. So I mean, I think you can also, with some of those people, you can say, what we have now is amnesty. The status quo is amnesty. And stand your ground on that. I do believe that there's a critical mass, ultimately, of Republicans who will take the position that amnesty, they'll either take the amnesty as an unconditional forgiveness, there's a few of them, but there's a lot who would say amnesty is a special path to citizenship. And, you know, there are ways to get creative about how to deal with the problem that solves their concern.
So I'm going to interrupt here because we need to move on with the program. And I would like for everybody to give a round of applause for Craig and Kristi.